It looks like a Freud hurricane has like exploded in my office. I'm sorry. It's really messy. I wish I could be one of those people that like kept things orderly. And but like the standard edition is strewn everywhere. like this is my office, and I'm also like packing to leave this afternoon. Anyway, do you want to hear a Freud line that I believe that I've repressed, but we're going to find at some point?
Yeah, let's do it.
When we get to the standard edition. It's one that I feel particularly indicted by. I normally have a good memory. I feel like I have a good memory for lines, like, or for particular phrases. That's often how I like remember key ideas. But at some point I encountered, and it might be in Ratman, the Ratman case study. We'll get to that. Or it might be in the introductory lectures. I don't know. But at some point, Freud says that obsessional neurotics, which is not a term we use now, but which definitely describes me, tend to go into fields where they can't find any concrete answers. And I think he actually name checks like philosophy and religion, and somewhere in my marginalia, which I think might have even been a library book. Sorry, Columbia University Libraries. It's like, oh God.
Actually, it's funny. You mentioned this line to me a couple episodes ago while we were prepping, and it sent me on a kind of like, I was like, I'm going to find that, because like I also remember this line.
You also felt personally attacked by it?
I did. And so I was looking for it, and I found something sort of like it in The Rat Man, and I found something sort of like it in Future of Illusion. But in any event,
maybe I confabulated it.
Well, I mean, it's one of those quotes that's like, I have a bunch of quotes like that too, like the one that I've misattributed incorrectly to like Alain Badiou, which I resent, but it's like, America, like that 300-year race war known as America, like it's just a fucking killer line. And I'm like,
oh, is it not Alain Badiou?
I don't think it is. I think it's like half him and some other asshole, but I put it together
to make it better.
Yeah. But basically I spent an entire like after, I'm not kidding. I got like perseveratively hung up on this, and I have this
I love being behind a paywall.
Yeah. I have that giant PDF of the standard edition, right? And so I was literally searching it for philosophy, profession, impossible, obsessional neurotics. And like,
good luck with that last one.
It became this totally self-fulfilling thing where I was looking for a quote about
the
something
behavior that you were actually enacting.
Yeah.
Persevered. Can you say that word for me?
Perseverative?
Yes, but with it as an adverb.
Perseveratively?
Yeah. It's too many syllables. It escaped me. Okay. Are we ready to get into the standard edition? Like not just the prefatory stuff, but like the real thing, the I hate to say the meat of it.
Real Freud hours?
Yuck. Let's do it. Can I do the podcast intro now?
No.
Yes.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today we are doing our second standard edition episode, but the first one that is behind the Patreon paywall, so we can speak freely. I don't know how many spicy takes you have about like the first three parts of the standard edition, but we'll see. We'll see where we're going to go. Let me tell you today what we're going to cover, which is I'm looking at volume 1, which is 1886 to 1899, pre-psychoanalytic publications and unpublished drafts. And we are specifically looking at 3 texts that are all from 1886. I should make that clear. The first is called Report on My Studies in Paris and Berlin. The second one, which is like a page long, is the preface to the translation of Charcot's lectures on the diseases of the nervous system. And to be clear, Freud did that translation himself, but we're just looking at the preface. That's what's in the standard edition. And then Observation of a Severe Case of Hemi-Anesthesia in a Hysterical Male, which is probably, I don't know, the first and third of those are where we're going to devote our energies today. We also wanted to say a couple words for those of you who are following along at home, whether in the sense of like you're reading along with us, or you plan to read certain bits along with us, or you're just like, these two people who are, on this wild, I can't call it a side quest, it's a full on quest. What are they consulting? So here are a few things that we looked at for today, and that we're going to be consulting going forward. One of these things that I think for biographies, there is the classic Ernest Jones biography, which is multiple volumes, but there's also a single volume version available that is much closer to Freud's actual, like in time-wise, closer.
And its wishes too, right? Like it's more, it's a bit of a hagiography.
It is a little bit of a hagiography. So it is not our primary, like that's not where we go for our bio, but it is like an text, right? It's the biography of Freud. We are frequently consulting Peter Gay's Freud, A Life for Our Times, which is not without its own hagiographic dimensions. But I think Hugh's a little bit less close. I mean, he's also writing, much later and not as like an intimate of Freud's. Today, also, the Adam Phillips book. Patrick, what's that title? You have it in front of you.
It's called Becoming Freud, and it's a tiny little volume I'm not being diminutive, or it's a short, composed to the Peter, compared to the Peter
Gay
Gay
book is like almost 1,000 pages.
Yeah,
so
it's a doorstop, and it is.
But it's great. You should read it. It's a
volume.
perfect book to have on your nightstand and read a little bit before bed.
Also, it really pisses me off that there isn't an audiobook available of it. I got to say that. Like, it's a wonderful, it's so strange to me that I'm going to recommend a bunch of other books here too. They're like really good psychoanalytic books, and yet there are no audiobooks. So if Jeff Bezos is listening, please make this happen. But yeah, in addition to the Peter Gay, which is kind of like a Cadillac volume of, it's the one of the 20th century. It's the great 20th century biography. There is this cute little book. And again, I'm not being, backhanded about this.
Yeah, it's just slim.
It's a slim little book, but also written in Adam Phillips's sort of delightful style, which is alternately hilarious and cutting. And he's a wonderful writer and analyst, and I recommend everything he does. But it's a little book called Becoming Freud, and it's in the Yale Jewish Live series, which is salient to us for a bunch of reasons. Because we're going to be talking about his Judaism a great deal, or rather his irreligious Judaism.
His relationship to Judaism is definitely going to be salient.
And that book also has the kind of cool conceit of being like, what if Freud died in 1915? Yeah. So it's a kind of cool thing if you want to get the first half of the Freudian world together. Yeah.
For sure. Okay. References. There's the classic Laplanche and Pontalis.
That slaps. I mean, it's by two French psychoanalysts.
That might sound hyperbolic, but actually it really
does.
No,
it's amazing. And it's available in English translation, I think, as the language or the vocabulary of psychoanalysis.
The language.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That's a great one, though, for like, if there's a term in Freud, you want to look it up, you want to know what it is in German, you want to know what it is in other languages, you want to know
get a copy
where
of
it came from. That's the one to get.
If you're in this journey, get a copy of Laplanche and Pontalis. Yeah. We also use some encyclopedias and dictionaries on the regular.
Yeah, the one that I would get your local university or public library to buy, because it's in addition to being enormous, costs a fortune, is the International Dictionary of Psychoanalysis, which is it's called a dictionary, but it's more like an encyclopedia.
It is, yeah.
So if Laplanche and Pontalis is for terms and concepts, you're like, what is a cathexis, right? Mm-hmm. Or how is ego formed? The dictionary is more like, you want to look up the biography of people, particularly not just Freud himself, but also it has articles for who was Wilhelm Reich? What's the history of psychoanalysis in Turkey? What's psychoanalysis in film? Who was Julia Kristeva? But also it has individual articles on different
concepts.
Yeah, concepts too.
It's great for concepts as well.
I'd also recommend, and this is a kind of a weird one though. You can probably find a free PDF of this one online because I think it may be public domain. But at one point, the American, I think, Psychological Association put together something called the Abstracts to the Work of Sigmund Freud, which is a coffee table volume, about 150 pages. And what it tries to do is it turns every single article in the standard edition into a like an abstract. In so doing, it murders all the style and it removes all the irony and undecidability. But if you want like every single book like summarized, where basically like every couple pages gets a sentence or every paragraph gets a line, that's the one to check out. And that'll just like walk you through linearly the Freudian oeuvre as a series of like declarative statements. So that can be kind of helpful.
I should just say also, one of the reasons that I recommend the Gay book, which again is like almost 1,000 pages, but it has some coverage. There's at least a paragraph or a couple of lines and sometimes pages that summarize everything that Freud wrote or everything in the standard edition. So that is a really fantastic reference for that. And then also there is the Salman Akhtar.
Yeah. So just to piggyback on the other thing that's really lovely about the Freud book, or rather about the Gay book, is that not only does it describe what's in all these articles, you get to learn how Freud felt about the articles that he wrote or everything that he wrote. And so if you're in a situation where you're like, you don't just want to know how something was conceived of, but how Freud felt about it after it was published, that's your go-to, in no small part because, and I think this could be reassuring to people, my man hated everything he did the moment it came out. He's like, this is my worst work. I can't believe this is out there. Let's just move on. So if you're in a self-flagellating
that's why he keeps
type,
writing he's like moving like a shark. Yeah.
I do want to recommend two more books though. And they're both by George McCary. And this is again one of those situations where it's like one is available by audiobook and the other one isn't. But they're both by George McCary. The one that's sort of directly, immediately relevant to us, and it's an award-winning volume. And again, it's a shame that it is an audiobook. And I'm an audiobook partisan. I do like 3 or 4 every week. But it's called Revolution in Mind.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's basically an intellectual history of multiple things, but of not just of Freud's sort of achievements, but actually very consciously a decentering of Freud as like Freud equals psychoanalysis, to instead be like, what are these different intellectual communities that come together around him in the late 19th century to produce first this thing he calls Freudianism and then this thing psychoanalysis. And so that's a really good one. It's like a multi-biography in intellectual history. So the second thing I wanted to recommend, and this is the one that is available on audiobook, that's George McCary's book called Soul Machine. And this one, actually, Abby, I really want to know what you think about it. Dan, I think you might get a real kick out of this one too.
I haven't read this one yet.
It's great. And in some ways, it's basically like a prequel to the first book. But I want to spend a minute on it because in some ways, what it basically is it's a history of how we got to the modern mind, or like to put it in another way, I think this is a line from him. Forgive me if I'm confabulating it, but like
it's the theme of today.
How did a mind become something that you could say you have, but also that you would be afraid to lose, right? Which is conceptually not given. And I want to, if for a moment, kind of,
I'll bump it higher on my to read.
Yeah, in the spirit of what McCary does there, and I am going to be drawing kind of heavily on this. I want to say that that's a really important one to check out, or at least that type of perspective, thinking about the non-givenness or the contingency of things like mind is important for us because, and particularly for those of you who are embarking on this wonderful project of the standard edition, is because you're going to encounter terms, names for disciplines, but also names for disorders.
Yeah.
And the deal is those terms may be the same terms we use today. And those terms, whether for diseases or for like divisions of a university, but they don't mean the same things.
No.
And in fact, sometimes there are a lot of like false friends. And so what you start to learn is that actually disciplinary definitions and terms for things like symptoms or diseases change and evolve over time. And if you don't mind, I just wanted to give an example about this.
Can I just say that every time you say false friends, I hear my grad school German professor saying like falsche Freunde.
Yeah. Gift is poison. Gift is poison. Do not drink the gift.
Yeah. I never encountered that phrase until specifically German. So it like German class. So it always makes me laugh.
And I mean, it's also like, among other things, like he points to the fact, so like, it's also a really interesting book because basically like, on the one hand, a lot of these disciplines that we associate contemporaneously, like you're going to go see a psychiatrist versus a psychologist, right? These seem like stable things that are, you can get credentialed in. They have their journals. You can get kicked out of those disciplines if you fuck up, right? But the truth of the matter is that a lot of the questions that they investigate or the ideas that they operationalize in encounters were previously ones that were primarily associated with disciplines that have disappeared, like alienism, right? Or phrenology, or ultimately even philosophy.
Yeah.
Right. And so when he uses this phrase of like this idea of like the soul machine, what he's actually doing there is referring to basically how post the Reformation, right? Or at least, in this mode that we call early modern, a whole bunch of different thinkers operating in a whole bunch of different languages, including ones that have like German has multiple words for stuff what we call the mind.
Sure.
Or like in English have multiple ways of talking about this thing we call the self or the person, how they come together to connect and produce a linked series of problems of translation, but also of conceptualization. And this is all the more important since what we're going to be talking about with Freud, I think both in this session and going forward, right, is also this weird thing that's called like the history of medicine, right? And the interpretability of pathology, of diseases, of symptoms, right? And this is really important too, because as we read Freud and we want to read him both charitably and critically, we first have to kind of understand what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And so like to give, I wanted to work through this with an example or two first,
Sure.
even because we're going to be building to this in terms of hysteria today, and that's going to be huge, right?
Can I, before you do this, I want to give you a breath. But also, I wanted to say to everyone, like the standard edition is my baby in terms of like as a series, and I'm going to have a bunch of guests. And I didn't just ask Patrick to be the guest because I'm married to him and he lives with me and it's super convenient, although those things are all very true. It's because I wanted him to function as the person here who has studied much more extensively than I have, like the intellectual history of this period. I will say, in terms of like, I can assess my own strengths and I am not a historian. I stay in my lane when it comes to like philosophy, psychoanalysis, and, the occasional foray into literary criticism. And so Patrick is here, not just because I like talking with him, although I do, but because I assigned him a whole bunch of things to set the scene for today. Like, so we're starting out, again, in 1886 with the report on my studies in Paris and Berlin. And let me say one thing about that, which is that it's objectively a hilarious place to start something that's like the standard edition. Because it is the kind of a report you write after you get a grant. And like, I can see like in my own life, I'm like, oh, right. Academic Affairs needs to see what my visible product was and like how I spent my like, whatever travel funds to go to like X conference or whatever. It's like the banality of that is hilarious. Like let's make sure we receive this by the end of the fiscal year, So I get, like, I totally understand why James Strachey and Alex Strachey and the whole team chose this moment where he's writing this report in 1886 about his travels in 1885 to 86 to Paris and Berlin, because it's Freud's turning point. He is studying with Charcot, who Patrick is going to tell you more in a bit, in Paris at the Salpêtrière. But it's also just like hysterical that we're starting with what is essentially like a, dear sirs, thank you so much for funding my trip. Like it's a great piece. It's actually a great piece of writing.
It's wonderful.
But all of this is to say that I asked Patrick to do some biography for us of who is Freud at this point in his life. So I want to turn things over. And Patrick, you may want to go now back to the false friends and whatnot. But I just wanted to be clear that like that's where we're coming from, is we don't want to just tell you what is happening in these texts, although like I am going to do that with some help from Patrick and from others. But as we start out, we really thought it would be helpful for you to get a sense of who Sigmund Freud is when he's been, he's a young doctor. He, so much of his work that we think of it as, even like the early Freud, he's not young during the early, so that's where we are right now. So Patrick, can I ask you to tell us about the young man who is no longer Sigismund Shlomo Freud, but has dubbed himself quite a long time ago Sigmund Freud, and what he is up to in 1885, 1886?
Well, yeah, I really want, that's where I want us to go and to build to this. But in order to do that, and again, this is the other thing, we're very invested in Freud, of course, but also I think we all, for different reasons, don't think the idea of the solitary genius has any intellectual coherence to it, and in fact has some really retrograde political dimensions to it.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
And
not about it.
Yeah, and so in some ways, we're doing the something paradoxical. We're reading the chronological writings of this person as he develops his own ideas, but also as he studies under other people.
Yeah, his interlocutors.
And as he takes ideas and goes about a kind of intellectual formation through institutions, through worldviews or vocabularies and professions in which other people loom large.
Yeah.
Right. And so to go back for a second first to the Grant stuff so we can build to Freud and to this intellectual history. Right. In other words, I'm saying we're trying to treat Freud as not just an individual, but a symptom, or at least a person who exists at a crossroads in intellectual history, right?
Sure.
And specifically on this document, this Grant, right? He has to basically not just justify how he spent the I don't know, it's something in guilders, and it's supposedly $250 is what they say in the standard edition. So in the 50s,
I don't know how much that is.
Yeah, who knows, right? But it's not just he has to justify spending it. He actually has to justify the fact that he took this money, saying he was going to do one thing, and now did something else. And the specific thing,
classic Freud.
But also he's I got this grant to study this thing called anatomic pathology. But now I want to do this thing called psychological neuropathology, or neuropathology and hysteria, right? And on the one hand, we're okay, sure, with those, cool, good for you. But also what exactly do these terms mean, right? And I think in order for us to grasp that, or at least to grasp that functionally, and to grasp the object of this, which is hysteria, we do have to kind of do an exercise together, if you don't mind. And I will say, I'm not a historian of medicine. I do teach a lot of stuff about the intellectual background of Freud. I teach stuff about the unconscious before Freud,
sure.
right? I teach stuff about the early modern stuff, and madness and Foucault and all this type of shit. So but I have read my fair share of these texts, and I'm familiar with some of these things. But I want to give us a very simple example.
Please.
Here, right? The year is 2023. We're walking down the street, and we see someone suddenly fall on the ground, and they're shaking, and they're foaming at the mouth, and their eyes roll back in their head. What do we think this could be? Before we call 911, we call 911. We want to help them. We want to prevent them from biting off their tongue. But what do we think this could be?
Rabies?
Yeah, it could be rabies, right? It could be epilepsy. Right? It could be, I don't know, a bad batch of fentanyl or something.
Yeah.
Right? We have this person suffering. We have a set of behaviors, or a set of things, but we have to
map them on to our existing set of possibilities, our templates.
Exactly. So in other words, we might be oh, I know someone who has this thing called epilepsy. I know what a seizure is, or I saw someone have a stroke, right? But let's pretend again, it's the year, I don't know, it's the 1200s, and we're in the market, and someone is having these same symptoms. So what do we think might be happening to them?
Demon possession.
Right.
Wait, the answer is demon possession.
The answer is demon possession, or that's the bad one. Or maybe we could be someone cast a curse on them, or maybe they're having
witches.
A vision. Yeah, burn them. Right.
We're not historians of medieval Europe. Just FYI.
No, we're really not. Note that it would be given to us that this behavior would be understood by reference to a whole explanatory schema about, what the world is, what our place in it is, right? How our bodies work, etc. And that would relate to institutions. And
evil might be more real to us in some sort of metaphysical way.
That would be a problem for us, right?
Right.
You're right. And whereas
we wouldn't be looking for scientific explanations.
Right. And whereas in 2023, we might be oh, did this person take their medication today? Do they have this bracelet on them? Right? So the whole point here then is that, particularly as we get into this, these disciplines of early neurology, or even what this thing is called psychoanalysis is, we're dealing with institutions, professions, but also concepts and worldviews that change over time and that ultimately boil down, and this I think is going to be a big theme today, dynamics of like authority, people explaining things, but also processes of interpretation and observation. And those things are not stable. Those aren't given. They're discoveries. We're like, oh, actually the brain involves electrical impulses, right? And that's one of the key things that is only discovered at a particular point in time and is very influential for Freud. So that was sort of like I want us to kind of like put ourselves in this space, because there's a way of we can get into like a kind of presentism where like, oh, these terms.
Like, oh, he's talking about obsessional neurosis. That's OCD, right? Yeah. Where we don't want to be so tidy in conflating these things.
Exactly, right? And this is going to be really, really important for us because of this thing called hysteria, which is like the sine qua non example of a disorder that both denotes certain things, right? So for example, if you were to go to a DSM, you'd find something called a conversion disorder, a somatoform conversion disorder, or a functional disorder, et cetera. And in fact, people are like, actually, there are lots of people, some anywhere from 10 to 40% of people in a neurologist's office may suffer from this. But also it's a slippery thing that changes over time. And and that implicates both what you observe in the first person, but also the people and educations that you receive that teach you to notice these things in the first place. And that's
right. Like for instance, if you believe that hysteria is something that can only afflict women, and that it is their womb wandering about their body, you might have different beliefs about it.
Precisely. And on the one hand, we can be like, oh yeah, that's obviously, because we're in the Western tradition, like that's obviously misogynistic and that's fucked up. But it's also, on the one hand, a misapprehension of, what hysteria was even in the 19th century, as we're going to see today. But also,
I guess I was actually thinking like way, way, way back in the past, like the origins of the term.
Yeah.
Which come from hysteria.
Yeah, exactly. Which comes from Galenic medicine. And this is one of these things too, where we might, without co-signing any of that misogyny, et cetera, we might be like, oh, I don't know, like, imagine that we are Greeks in togas. I guess they didn't wear togas, but we're Greeks and we see...
That was Romans.
Yes, I know.
You were getting excited.
Okay. We're fully nude and covered in olive oil. Okay, that's what we're doing.
Woo! This took a turn.
But like we see someone suffering from what now we might call postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. Right. Someone just gave birth to someone, and now they want to kill them, or they're talking to people who aren't there. So you could see how, given the resources that are available at the time, you're like, oh yeah, her womb got disconnected by the birthing process, right? Or to give another example, and this is going to be really key as we get into the Salpêtrière, right? Some of you may be familiar with like the idea of dementia, right? Of course, the tragic reality of it is a thing that happens to people as they get older, right? Well, there is also, to use the Latin term for it, this thing called dementia praecox, precocious dementia, which is what we call schizophrenia. Yeah. And on the one hand, we ourselves are like, well, this happens to different people at different times in their lives. Maybe one of these things is genetic, one isn't, one's environmental, et cetera. But if you put yourself on the outside for a moment, you're like, oh, here is a person talking to people who aren't there, right? Here is a person becoming agitated for no apparent reason. We might think these two things are the same, and only later do we realize that they have different etiologies, different, what you could call statuses in terms of these disciplines of or these perspectives that you call nosology or nosography, which is the systematic description of symptoms and their coordination in different diseases. And this is going to be very relevant for us too, because if there's one thing that Charcot does, is he is the founder or the father of an entire branch of nosography and nosology bearing on certain types of symptoms. So I just wanted to say that to sort of
great.
Do that work.
It's great. I really appreciate it. And I think that will be one of the things that we're going to track is some of this vocabulary. We're going to try to translate it to a certain extent. And sometimes we can do it in that sort of clean way that Patrick, like tidy way, where what Freud means by dementia praecox is what we call schizophrenia. But sometimes these are more shifting targets. So, Patrick, we have Freud. We're poised to get into this text. It's 1885 or it's 1886, whatever. 1886 he's writing. 1885 he's actually making the trip, or the trip is 85 to 86. Who is this guy? What does his world look like? What's he up to? Take it away.
One thing to sort of say, I'm going to give you my 3 points, bottom line up front. I'm going to use the BLUF thing, right?
Okay, I love it.
Yeah,
I love it.
That's one of those military terms I think actually very helpful. Begin and meno, bottom line up front. 3 things. 1, Freud is like axiomatically, he's a titanic figure of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
But the world that he's born into is
in 1856.
In the 1850s is distinctively
in Moravia,
19th century.
Yeah.
Right? It's a world that has features and maps, but also like terminologies and conceptions and ideas of expertise that is very different from ours, even if it sometimes seems close. The second thing I'll say, and this is again another theme, is that his biography is marked by a lot of personal ambition, above all in terms of science. He thinks about himself as a scientist till the very end.
Yes.
But note, the disciplines that entails him pursuing, the problems that he explores, are not necessarily ones that we might call scientific now.
Sure.
And he faces a lot of resistance from within the scientific community, both abstractly, but also between specific institutions. Mm-hmm. And this is the half of it here. One of the major resistances that he gets into in these institutions, but also in his reception in the 20th century and in the present, isn't just ideas of science, but also the reality of anti-Semitism. And that's going to impact all these institutions. So that's the second thing. So we've got, it's 20th century, 19th century sort of straddling this idea of personal ambition against resistance and anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. The third idea that I think is very helpful, and this bears on is the way he hit that ambition and that drive relates to institutions, but also individual people and concepts, including ones that are given him by other people, but that he formulates himself. And what characterizes those relationships is a kind of pattern of idealization followed by, if not abjection, then rejection.
Freud is that guy, is that person that always has a new best friend and then has a falling out with them and then makes another new best friend. That's throughout his whole life.
Yeah, like he gets part of this idea of this ambition. This is a big theme here. Seems like, I'm going to be the person who does this. I discovered this thing. Look, I've just found this guy. This person is brilliant. This is the person I'm going to model my whole life on. And then, or even he'll be like, I just had a really good idea. And this is one of those dynamics in the gay biography. He's like, I just wrote a great thing. Oh shit, I wrote a bad thing, right? Where he's like, he gets attached to something. He thinks it's the hot new shit. He thinks he's figured it all out. This is going to make his name. And then it disappoints him. And he rejects it. But note, he doesn't just sort of reject it. This is a kind of very German dialectic here. He synthesizes it. He moves on. He goes on to something else. He takes something with him. So these themes, right, of like this vanished world, his personal ambition, but also his kind of like agonistic relationship around him and people is really key.
I should say, if you hear us not doing Freud's full-on biography right now, that's a deliberate choice. Because that is going to come up so much in later parts of the standard edition that you're going to hear more on Freud's personal life, family dynamics, all of those things from us in coming episodes. We're not leaving it out, but we're going to do it as it becomes particularly relevant and as he is giving us so much autobiographical material in his writing.
Yeah. And so I'm going to hit the high points of it just so we can get him to Paris.
Thank you.
But please note that this is...
Let's get him to Paris.
We'll get him to Paris. But note these dynamics in terms, like these themes, those 3 things, right? So he's born in 1856 in this place that is at the time called Freiburg, right? In a nation that is at the time called the Empire of Austria. A decade later, that becomes...
It was just Moravia, right, at that time?
Moravia is a region.
Okay.
Yeah, and a sort of administrative unit. But a decade later, this becomes something called the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. And, over time, it changes its names. But it's, I grew up calling it the Czech Republic. Now it's called Czechia. The point here, though, in all this is that, again, it's a world that has different boundaries and maps, and this weird state that he's born into, this thing that becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is on the one hand very modern and very cosmopolitan, but also has some weird features to it, right? So like, just to say this, because this is kind of helpful, and maybe have in your mental image, if you've seen those pictures of like Franz Ferdinand before he got capped, right? Like all those guys in like the weird outfits and they got the tassels and the floofy hats and shit. You're like, it's a world that feels kind of Victorian, but also he's driving around in a car, right? So this Austro-Hungarian state is one that is, among other things, it has anywhere from, I've seen it quoted different ways, its national anthem is sung it has officially 8 to 12 different language versions. So from like, you can sing it in Wallachian, which is Ukrainian, or in Yiddish, or in German, etc. Right? These things change. It's also a weird place that has like compulsory accident insurance, single payer health care, all this other stuff, and a remarkable education system that is on the one hand, very secular, but also includes required Christian education, but from which Jews like Freud are exempted, right? And so it's a weird state, right? It's multi-ethnic, it's polyglot, and it's also very much doomed. And one thing that's going on with Freud's story is he is basically trying to establish himself in this state that, on the one hand, is very welcoming of Jews, particularly in the military and some other institutions, but also has certain like glass ceilings that they can't hit, or and that leads him to seek intellectual fulfillment elsewhere, specifically in Paris and Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a cosmopolitan world, but also one marked by certain restrictions. And of course, it's women can't vote, among other things. So it's an imperfect thing, and if for some reason you are one of those people online that is an Austro-Hungarian revivalist, which is coming back in a big way, that's really freaky and weird. Don't do that. Okay. Anyways. So yeah, more about Freud's family and his background, right? Like his initial birth name is Sigismund Shlomo, right? Which is, and Freud, is, it means joy, right? Fried is the Yiddish analog to this. He has his mother is Jacob. Sorry, there we go. Like, this is the thing to say.
You got to leave that in, Dan.
Yeah, we should say this. The moment we're doing the thing like, oh, how does this person's writing relate to their family? We're doing Freudianism. Like, you can't unring that bell.
Yeah.
So yeah, his father is Jacob. His mother is Amalia, right? Jacob is they are lower middle class, and at times in very difficult financial straits. His father is a wool merchant with roots in Galicia, which is sort of modern Ukraine, Poland. And among other things, we should say, this is going to come back. These are going to be haunting all these texts that you guys read together, or you all read together. The financial struggles of the family have included, for at one point, one of his father's brothers spending a decade in prison for counterfeiting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that like idea of a parental...
Which like possibly Freud's dad was also involved with.
So there's some question about this. Yeah.
Okay,
like,
we won't... Sorry.
No. This is great. Because the theme here, and this is actually going to be relevant for the Charcot.
Dodgy fathers,
but also the idea of like the hereditary taint.
Yeah.
Right? Which is going to be an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
Amalia, for her part, is also Jewish, and she comes from Odessa. She's related ultimately to one of the Hamburg chief rabbi.
Yeah.
Right? She's in a slightly, or was in a slightly higher class position, and kind of married down.
And she married somebody twice her age.
That's the key thing here, right?
Yeah.
And like again,
is she 20 and he's 40, something like that? There's like a 20-year age gap.
He is 21
Twitter
years old.
would not look fondly upon the relationship between Freud's parents.
And the records are messy. But Jacob had 2 previous marriages and several children from them, of which 2 survive, right? So one of those, in fact, had gotten married and had a child when Freud was born. So Freud is literally born and uncle, which is a kind of interesting thing to think about. Again, this is a very different world of families, right?
Right.
They then go on to have, I think, 9 kids.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Of which Freud is the first child.
Mm-hmm.
And he's
the eldest boy.
Yeah. Is, according to Amalia, mein goldener Siggi, my little golden Siggi, right? So again, this is very Freudian in some ways. We want to call it that, right?
Yeah. Avant la lettre.
Avant la lettre, yeah. And I should say, it's not just Freud's own memories of this, but also of a lot of his grandchildren, or rather of his grandchildren, and Jacob and Amalia's grandchildren have written on their own memoirs. The image you kind of get is that Jacob was a very sweet and nice guy, kind of tender, but also he's always compared to Amalia, who is understood to be very strong-willed, if even a little narcissistic. And she, by the way, lives until the age of 93, whereas Jacob dies in 1896, and in so doing prompts Freud, well, to create psychoanalysis and to do this kind of interesting sort of self-analysis, right? But yeah, so another thing to be aware of here, right up front, is that they're Jewish, right? As we've already said this, but that Freud's original birth name is Sigismund Shlomo. which is a name that he'll change in no small part because of his desire to advance within this kind of space that there is a lot of anti-Semitism. It blocks him from certain things. And significantly too, Freud, when he's named Sigismund, is named after Jacob's father, who dies literally 2 months before Freud is born. So this is another kind of, this idea of like the parental figure, or particularly the patriarch, is very important. And just to flash something that's coming ahead for us, right? In the family that Freud will have with his beloved wife, Martha, Freud will name all the children unilaterally, and he will name the children, all of them, after major mentors and intellectual figures in his own life. So his son Martin, for example, is named after Martin Charcot.
Jean-Martin.
Yeah, Jean-Martin Charcot.
Sure.
Right. So in any event, the family is ethnically Jewish, but they're not particularly observant. This is sort of contested, but the bottom line...
we'll do more on that.
Yeah. Jacob is, he's in the Haskalah tradition, right? So he's got this Enlightenment thing going on. And Freud's experience of Judaism, at least early on, is one in which he gets read Bible stories, and he, instead of going to Christian sort of Sunday school in the Austro-Hungarian situation, he instead goes to learn Hebrew a little bit, and etc. But he also, for example, has a Czech nanny who apparently taught him how to apparently she gets kicked out of the house either for stealing jewelry, but also for basically teaching Freud to say the Lord's Prayer before meals. And apparently young Freud once got up one day and did this, and they're like, okay, this is not acceptable, you're fired. But the point...
Tough but fair.
Tough but fair, yeah. The point here, though, and this is back to that one of these ideas of Freud's dynamics, intellectual and personal, right, is that his dad, on the one hand, he remembers as being a pushover, as being a kind of intellectual lightweight. But on the other hand, also acknowledges, for example, and this is a key thing in the family, that they set aside the money for Freud to pursue education to the point at which he had his own little room to study in.
Yeah.
Right? And so his father, who is very loving and sort of unintellectual, also sort of this ambivalence towards the father figure is really key as we get to Charcot.
Yeah.
Now, from the very start, Freud is precociously intellectual and has big ambitions. Right? He says of himself, I was always the bold oppositionist, always on hand when an extreme had to be defended. Right? And by the age of 17, he's graduated from gymnasium, which is like high school, and he wants to go into law, but decides actually that what he really wants to do instead is make a name for himself as a major figure in the natural sciences, which then leads him ultimately to medicine. From 1875 to 1880, he goes to the University of Vienna, where his education is in, among other things, zoology, physiology, Aristotelian metaphysics, right? It has a strongly Darwinian component, right? He's very much, his educated, the people who teach him are very major figures in sort of that tradition. But there's a very strong influence of an emphasis on observation, on laboratory experimentation, on testing things, right? So this idea of seeing things and documenting things and trying to understand how what you're given visually reflects underlying structures is a through line.
Yeah, I'm going to say more about observation as we get to these texts. Yeah.
Awesome. He gets into neurology, which at this point is a very big deal science because Galvani has just discovered the neuron, and I think it's the 1850s, right? So the idea that you can electrical impulses produce nerve movements and psychomotor movements is really key. And as a young intellectual up-and-coming scientist, he actually does a lot of cool stuff, like he invents a new method for dyeing tissue samples, and he also gets really into cocaine in multiple senses. One as a sort of an augment for his lapse energy, but also he's interested in being the person who discovers and popularizes cocaine as a local anesthetic. And that's what he first thinks he's going to do. And it still uses a local anesthetic in certain types of surgery, but unsurprisingly, it's not, something you can get at the local drugstore for cash because of its addictive properties and the way it destroys lives. So this is one of these first big disappointments, right? He's like, I'm going to be the guy who finds cocaine. Right? I'm going to be the guy.
Are we not doing phrasing?
Yeah, I'm going to be the guy who medicalizes cocaine. He also has a couple other ones too, where he goes, for example, to Trieste to try and figure out, which is the major European port, the Mediterranean port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think it's the only major one, where his scientific thing is, I'm going to be the person who figures out the sexual difference between lamprey eels.
I love that part. That's one of my favorite hits of... Yeah.
He
Okay, go ahead.
He can't
Go
do
ahead.
it. He can't do it either. Apparently, people couldn't figure out how to. The phrase is sexing eels. Apparently, we didn't figure it out until the 1940s, I guess. So it was a very hard thing. But again,
he was dead by then.
Yeah, he was definitely very dead by then. But so note these ideas like, here's a thing that I'm going to be the major standard bearer for. But oh wait, I can't do it. Right now, at some point in the by 1881, he becomes a doctor of medicine. But he also has met Martha Bernays, right? And actually was her grandfather.
That's
who was the
going to
chief
be
rabbi
his
of
wife.
Hamburg. Yeah, my bad. It's a woman who's going to be his wife, who comes from a higher class position than him too.
No, you weren't wrong. Amalia is descended from an important rabbi.
Yeah, and but Martha has the Hamburg German connection, and Martha has this interesting thing too, where she's very pro Bismarck, all this shit. It's very interesting, but the point here, though, is that at a certain point, his mentors in the scientific establishment actually take young Freud aside, and they're like, dude, you can't raise a family as a scientific researcher. You have to become a medical doctor instead. You have to specifically start a private practice, right? So in order for him to do this...
And to get married.
Okay,
this is an important thing. He had a very long engagement, like 4-year engagement, something like that.
It's a very, very long engagement. His whole thing is he's got to find a sub-discipline of medicine in which he can establish a gainful private practice.
So that he can get married.
And that's why he gets a grant of what Dan just looked up, is the equivalent of 10 grand today
9,000.
or something. Yeah. To go to Paris, to leave the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to study what's called anatomic pathology.
So that takes us, thank you, Patrick, to the report on my studies in Paris and Berlin, which was written in 1886 for a trip in 1885 and 1886. And again, the structure of this is in some ways extraordinarily banal. He is walking the people that gave him the money for the trip through what he did there, except in typical Freud fashion. And I think this connects really nicely to what Patrick was saying about the emphasis on observation. He can't help but write a character sketch of Charcot. And this is something I want to say that I personally love about Freud and about reading Freud. And you see it in the famous case studies that we'll get to, and also in the not famous one that we're going to get to today, not momentarily, in half an hour.
Yeah.
Kind of regardless of genre. And he is a man that writes in so many different genres, as we will see. He does this conjuring up for you of the people that he encounters in ways that are just extraordinarily telling. And they're telling both about Freud himself, and they're also telling, I think, about the people that he's writing about. But it's imagine going on a research trip and you're like, oh, I'm also going to describe the conference center. Let me just tell you a little bit about then I went to Reading Terminal Market and I had this fantastic, Mennonite donut. I mean, it's he goes and he's like, I'm at the Salpêtrière. Let me tell you a little bit about the building and the grounds. Yeah. He can't help. I mean, I'm not telling you what Freud's intention was. I have no idea. And this is a death of the author kind of podcast, I think, in some sorts of ways. So I'm not trying to tell you how he was thinking about it. I'm describing my own reading of the way that it seems to me that Freud feels sort of compelled to observe and describe even the things that don't seem to call out for description. And I guess the part that I want to highlight about this piece is that the Charcot-Freud relationship is the centerpiece for me here. And I'll ask Patrick in a minute or two to tell us a little bit more about Charcot. But before you hear it from him, I want you to hear it from Freud. And I'll say we often, I think, there's this language. You don't hear mothers of things, but we often hear oh, Freud is the father of psychoanalysis. Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. Ferdinand de Saussure is the father. I don't know, whatever, of structural linguistics. You hear this language, and what you get is something that's really sui generis, right? Psychoanalysis springs from his forehead, right? He is this paradigmatic father figure, Freud is for us, who is himself obsessed with fathers. And one of the things you get out of, the beginning here with the report on my studies in Paris and Berlin is the way that Freud can't help talking about Charcot. So who are Freud? I start reading this to think, who are Freud's fathers? And of course, there's Jacob Freud, and we will talk. There's so many really good anecdotes that we will get to, I promise, in a different episode. But also Charcot, plus in the background of this text is Ernst Wilhelm von Brücke from the Institute of Physiology in Vienna, who Freud in this piece refers to as, this is a quote, my revered teacher. So Freud already has a lot of fathers going on in what is, again, essentially a grant report. And so let me give you just a little taste of what he says about Charcot. The man who is at the head of all these resources and auxiliary services is now 60 years of age. He exhibits the liveliness, cheerfulness, and formal perfection of speech which we are in the habit of attributing to the French national character, while at the same time he displays the patience and love of work which we usually claim for our own nation. The attraction of such a personality soon led me to restrict my visits to one single hospital and to seek instruction from one single man. I abandoned my occasional attempts at attending other lectures after I had become convinced that all they had to offer were for the most part well-constructed rhetorical performances. Okay, I'm skipping a little bit. This is, again, a quote. The clinic at the Salpêtrière, this is where Charcot is working, he's the main guy, provided such a plethora of new and interesting material that it needed all my efforts to profit by the instruction which this favorable opportunity afforded. And he's talking about how the weekly timetable is going. And the line I want you to hear is, on Mondays, Charcot delivered his public lecture, which delighted its hearers by the perfection of its form, while its subject matter was familiar, blah, 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 whatever. Well, the point that I want you to hear is that what Patrick was talking about, that idealization. So one more little bit from the Paris report about Charcot. This is the longest bit, and this is part of what I want you to hear is an image of Charcot that I would make an argument, at least I'll make a provisional argument. I don't know how much I'm going to commit myself to this, is he describes Charcot in these idealizing terms that I think actually end up being a lot how others might characterize Freud later in his own life. Okay, so I'm going back to quoting from the Paris and Berlin report. As regards scientific contact, I was scarcely given preference over any other foreigner, for the clinic was accessible to any physician who presented himself, and the professor's work proceeded openly, surrounded by all the young men acting as his assistants, as well as by the foreign physicians. He seemed, as it were, to be working with us, to be thinking aloud, and to be expecting to have objections raised by his pupils. Anyone who ventured might put in a word in the discussion, and no comment was left unnoticed by the great man. The informality of the prevailing terms of intercourse and the way in which everyone was treated on a polite footing of equality, which came as a surprise to foreign visitors, made it easy even for the most timid to take the liveliest share in Charcot's examinations. One could see how, to begin with, he would stand undecided in the face of some new manifestation which was hard to interpret. One could follow the paths along which he endeavored to arrive at an understanding of it. One could study the way in which he took stock of difficulties and overcame them. And one could observe with surprise that he never grew tired of looking at the same phenomenon, till his repeated and unbiased efforts allowed him to reach a correct view of its meaning. When, in addition to all this, the complete sincerity is borne in mind which the professor displayed during these sessions, it will be understood how it is that the writer of this report, like every other foreigner in a similar position, left the Salpêtrière as Charcot's unqualified admirer. Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about Jean-Martin Charcot?
Yes.
the subject of this idealization.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I wanted to also, just from the same period, share with you, I was looking through Freud's letters to Martha about this, just about Charcot too.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if we think that that's gushy, here's this, like, it goes another level up, right? And this, again, he's writing to the woman who he's described as the person who he loves most in the world, right? Charcot, who is one of the greatest of physicians and a man whose common sense borders on genius, is simply wrecking all my aims and opinions. I sometimes come out of his lectures as from Notre Dame with an entirely new idea about perfection. Whether this seed will ever bear fruit, I don't know. But what I do know is that no other human being has ever affected me the same way.
Whew.
And if you don't mind, I promise this is going to cash out. From the same period of years, at one point Freud winds up going to the other center. We probably won't talk. We actually aren't going to talk about Berlin today, but one of the other centers of
it's not a big part of this.
No.
Paris is really the centerpiece. I think it's just Berlin is in the title because he also went there. And again, Grant Report.
But during the same period, or roughly the same period, he also goes to Berlin and spends some time in Germany, and this brings him into contact with his father's family in Breslau. And I'm going to read you a little bit of another note to Martha because he's very honest, but also, just to spoiler alert here, he talks about his own family using Charcot's medical diagnostic terms. So Freud writes another letter to Martha, and I promise this will become much more. You're probably already seeing where this is going, but he bumps into an uncle. He's the younger brother of my father, an ordinary man, a merchant. The story of his family is very sad. Of the 4 children, only one daughter is normal and married in Poland. One boy is hydrocephalic and feeble-minded. Another, who was a young man, showed some promise, went insane at the age of 19. And another daughter went the same way when she was 21. I had so completely forgotten this uncle that I've always thought of my own family as free of any hereditary taint. But since I have become thinking about Breslau, it all came back to me, and I am terrified that the fact of one of the other sons dying very unhappy as an epileptic is something I cannot shift to my mother's side, with the result that I have to acknowledge a considerable, quote, neuropathological taint, as it is called. Now, yeah, we're all kind of like, what, right? So he's like, that phrase, this concern with heredity, and particularly the term neuropathological taint, this is terms and a perspective that he learned from Charcot.
Mm-hmm. So, Patrick, who is Charcot?
Yeah. So let's talk about who Charcot is. Charcot is sometimes called, or frequently called, the father of the discipline of neuropathology or neurology. Yeah, speaking of fathers. And we're going to get to Charcot, but as I just did with Freud, I want to go big intellectual history stuff and get us to Charcot and this weird place at the Salpêtrière and to the hysterics, right? So first thing to know, right, is that there's a reason Freud goes to Paris rather than like finding, I don't know, some other, like, I'm trying to imagine like Linz or I don't know, somewhere else in the Austro-Hungarian sphere where he could, right?
Yeah.
And that's because Paris is a really special place, obviously in general in the 19th century, and it's wonderful now, please, I'm about to go to Paris. But also it's a very special place in terms of the history of medicine and the history of both neurology and what becomes psychology and psychopathology, right? There are a bunch of reasons for this. One, and here I'm drawing on the work of Elizabeth Rudinesco, you could say that there's something very interesting that happens in terms of the Enlightenment history, but also in terms of the way the French Revolution specifically produces legislation that grants legal rights to categories of people that are called the mad. And among other things, this endows institutions and demands certain practices of care such that, like, to put it in kind of the way some post-structuralists do, like madness is written into the law, but also very practically, this just means that they're institutions of asylums, which are also teaching institutions, and that there is a degree of, if not social security, then there is at least a focus on ongoing treatment, and also that's linked to education and teaching. Now, it's also worth saying here, too, that, and here I'm thinking back to the work of George McCary, again, I want to recommend that, is that the French psychological tradition has walked a very sort of interesting line in terms of what you could call the mind-body problem, or what we might, more broadly speak, the distinction between like the body and the soul, right, if you want to talk in those terms. Mm-hmm. And this takes a big thing in the 1870s where a fellow named Ribot produces a very influential book called a work in scientific psychology, sort of the discipline he founds. And it, on the one hand, he does the thing where he rejects the soul, but on the other hand, there's a rejection of the positivist tradition that's associated with Auguste Comte. And without getting too much into this positivist tradition basically says what happens in the mind is just epiphenomenal to an underlying mechanistic stuff.
Yeah.
And again, the theme here is observation. Comte is basically says you cannot do science about inner life because you can't observe yourself, and those observations are always subjective, right? Now, Ribot and subsequent thinkers, including, crucially for our purposes, Charcot, chart a very fine line where they say, well, actually, no, without co-signing the soul, you can take experiences of psychological distress, or at least the observation of certain types of behaviors, as revealing something about interiority, right? And so generally speaking, this produces this type of approach to psychology that has sort of three features. One, there is it's associationistic in the sense of like Locke or Hobbes. Basically, like you learn things because you associate things. Your brain, like you learn a word for a thing, and that's how the thing becomes. You have a little, like, I don't know, like a little nodule in your brain that says croissant, and that's how you associate it, right? Basically, the thinking proceeds through association.
Yeah.
Is right the idea. Correlatively, there's an emphasis on psychopathology as disassociation, right? Your brain is chugging along, but then suddenly, boom, something happens, and now instead of, I don't know, a croissant, you think of feces, and thus you start vomiting. And this is your explanation of like someone with an eating disorder. I'm being very crude here, but like this is like this idea of like association is normal, disassociation is a source of mental suffering and pain, right? A phrase that's sometimes used, I've seen it attributed both to Ribot and to Charcot, is the idea that pathology are nature's experiments. So the idea here then is that the people who are mad are not like a category difference, but rather that by looking at them, we can learn something about the normal. And you can already see this is relevant for Freud too, right?
Sure.
The third thing, and here is a element that on the one hand is, well, this is something that Charcot also believes, and that gets him into trouble ultimately, and that ultimately causes Freud to split for him, but that also is really overdetermined in terms of all the kind of groundwork we've been laying out here, is that there's a strong emphasis on heredity and degeneration through the family.
Yeah.
Right. And this is, Charcot will call it sometimes, he uses the phrase, and tash, which is like a stain or it's literally poetically like a cloud that hangs over you. Right. And that's the idea of the neurological taint that Freud mentions there. Right. So
you can see where there are all these sort of deeply problematic eugenic ideas that could flow from that.
Without getting, it's deeply problematic and specifically anti-Semitic. And so, that's going to be one of the things that later, when Freud parts Charcot, parts with Charcot, the remarkable historian of medicine and one of my teachers, Sander Gilman, basically, I think makes the case that part of that is Freud dealing with, for him, the hereditary taint isn't just being embarrassed about his dad, it's also being very conscious of anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
So Charcot, who's born, I think, 1825, comes up in the school of medical psychological thinking, or rather specifically neurological thinking ultimately, that is inflected by that sort of attention that Ribot gives us, that's an emphasis on association, right, as normal, disassociation as pathological, pathology as suggesting normality, right, through experimentation, and also, crucially, an emphasis on heredity and degeneration with the locus of the family, right? So no, Freud's going to keep the family, but eventually turn away from the other stuff, right? Now, Charcot himself starts out as a medical student, and he interns at this place called the Salpêtrière, which we'll talk about more in a moment. And he starts out a kind of Comtean epiphenomenalist. He's basically like, no, the stuff that people say or do or think, that's all kind of secondary fluff. And he thinks that until he encounters a certain type of patient who we're also going to talk about in a second, right? So to get at this, though, Charcot interns at this place called the Salpêtrière. He's fascinated by
a hospital.
It's at this point, it's more of a hospice, right? And specifically, it's a hospice for elderly women, but also it's basically kind of like a dumping ground for all sorts of people. And this is, bear in mind the stuff we were talking about earlier about like different categories of disorders being lumped together based upon their outward sort of classification. But he vows that he's so fascinated by the people he says there, he's going to come back. He's like, after I graduate, I'm going to come back here. And he does. And he transforms that place into basically ground zero for the discipline that is later called neurology and neuropathology specifically.
Which is why you hear Freud talking about all of the foreign doctors that are coming to study with him.
Exactly. And I should say that this is not, the Salpêtrière is not in like downtown Paris. It's not even near the medical schools. Like it's a schlep, right? And it's sort of eccentric, but he turns it into a center, right? So, and he turns it specifically into a center for people who are suffering from a wide range of what are at the time he thinks neurological disorders. So that includes people that we might say like have things like Parkinson's, Huntington's, aphasia, ataxia, traumatic brain injuries, but also, crucially, these people we'll get to in a second, hysterics, right? By the time Freud is there, this quote unquote grand asylum of misery includes some 5,000 patients, right? Of all sorts. It started out, the place started out by Salpêtrière, I should say. That word, kind of hard to pronounce. It's literally the saltpeterery.
Yeah.
It's the saltpeter place. It's and I don't want to get too started on that because I could totally record an episode about this. It's where you refine stuff for gunpowder.
Yeah.
Right. And Freud mentions this in his little letter. In addition to being like, here are some nice buildings that they have. It's kind of wild.
Didn't they also feed saltpeter to like boys in schools to make them less...
Yes. You can also still get it for horses, supposedly, for this purpose. This is one of those things that this is as they...
Less horny. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah.
Dan's looking at me like, less what? Less what?
No, I would say less virile. Like,
It's supposed to diminish libidos. And one of the things, like if you're in the military or in prison,
you don't want,
like,
you want them to work or you want them to do military things. So you don't want them to be, being led around by their dicks.
This is both, there's no actual medical basis for this.
No,
this
no, it's totally nonsense. Yeah. It's just, but that is something that
people still believe today, like people still do give their horses this sometimes. And this is one of those things, again, like this bespeaks or belies the ways in which like our awareness of modern medicine coexists with ultimately like the handed down concepts and bromides of what are like ultimately like alchemy, right? Because saltpeter is a major element of that.
Yeah.
And interestingly, too, another thing to put on the table, which we'll get into in a moment, is this idea of hypnosis, which starts out as like an occultist thing, but then is medicalized by Charcot.
So we're at Charcot's Salpêtrière.
Yeah.
What's happening?
So
what are these weekly lectures and all that stuff that Freud's attending?
So Charcot is the other thing to say about what's happening just at this place, right? At the Salpêtrière, is that because of those legal elements and that I just talked about, right, about how like there's certain things written into law, is that the people who are there are some outpatient stuff. There are some people who come and go, but the people who are inpatient with very severe pathologies, the moment they're wards of the state, and that means that the moment that they die, there can be autopsy performed on them, right? This is very important for our purposes, and just to think about for a second, because it means that instead of just being like, oh, here is a behavior that we have to explain in terms of demons or our metaphors, or like maybe we think like we say something like a serotonin imbalance, which might as well be like, I don't know, like a fork humor bullshit, right? We use these. The idea here is just because we use more modern language, this is more true. In the case of a place where you can do an autopsy like this,
now you can start looking for organic
Yes.
sources for seemingly psychic or for behavior.
You can specifically compare lesions in their brains or the absence of lesions, which becomes very crucial, with clinical signs from life histories. And what Charcot does, and this is why he's sometimes called the founder of nosography, if you want to use that kind of term, is he starts classifying and documenting patients that he sees.
Yes.
And he uses a whole suite of new tools for this. Among other ones, for example, he does a lot of things like casts of their faces, right? Because, again, like think like people who have nervous, I don't mean nervous like anxiety, but like neurological tics.
Yes.
Right? Or like someone whose face is frozen into a rictus of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Or he systematizes, there's a big emphasis, and this is something that Sander writes about a lot, on posture and gait. Mm-hmm. So like people who have like a paralysis of one limb that's dragging, he starts like, well, this is one category of person. He even starts doing things like photography. right? And doing multi-frame photographs of people having various fits,
Yes.
right? So
Which are fascinating to look at.
they're amazing. There's a beautiful coffee table volume, which we'll link to, called, I think it's The Invention of Hysteria, that includes some of these photos. But so in other words, he's big into like the new media and also into experimenting with things, right? So people will have, he will prescribe anticholinergics. He's one of the first people to do this. He prescribes ergo-based drugs, and he tries new things. Like when, for example, some Russians are like, well, what you got to do with people who are suffering from certain types of neurological disorders is what's called suspension therapy, which is what it sounds like. Basically, you hang them upside down. Yeah. He's like, he tries it, and then he's like, no, this is fucked up. It hurts people. And I should say, Charcot, there's some lovely lines about, like, he has some lines about you can't hurt people. Like, don't hurt people.
But at the same time, he is like parading his patients out.
Yes. Yeah.
You're going to get to that.
Yeah, that's about to where I'm going to get.
Okay.
But
I'm sorry. I just don't want to make him seem like this paragon of...
No. That's what we're building to, because in some ways, it's that we can understand those public performances as themselves a type of experimental procedure.
Yes.
Insofar as that what's crucial in them is this thing called hypnosis, but also real-time diagnosis. And I should say too, like, some of these discoveries and things that he experiments with are still used today. So for example, like for those of you who are interested in physical therapy, vibration therapy, right? He basically had a whole bunch of patients who were like, I have neurological pain, but after I ride a horse, I'm better. So he creates a special chair, and this is now used in recuperating athletes too. It's also the case, though, that he, and if, there's things called Charcot disorders and diabetic neuropathy, et cetera, right? But like what he does do, though, is at some point he encounters, or at least tries to use in a scientific, classifiable, replicable way, this thing called hypnosis, right? And he does that as part of his broader enterprise of learning, in which he has different types. He has twice weekly lectures, one of which involves literally like handing out like physical aids, and like literally he'll give people bones of like people that are warped. He'll show images of like primitive PowerPoints of like damaged nerves and stuff. But he also does one where he will bring someone in, he will ask them questions, and he's sitting in the audience.
You mean the patient?
The patient,
He brings a patient.
He brings a patient in, he'll ask questions like, so when did you start having this symptom? Wow, et cetera. And then he will diagnose them in real time.
And this, I think, is, if people know something about the Salpêtrière, it's about these sorts of weekly like performances.
Yeah, these performances. And he starts noticing essentially that there's a category of people who are having dysfunctions, things like temporary blindness, fainting, seizures, paralysis, etc., which are what we could call dysfunctions dysfunctions, I'm already using the term. They're problems of function, but that there isn't necessarily an underlying organic problem. Right? So these are people who are behaving as though, and you've cut up enough brains of people who have gone full Phineas Gage and like had like, I don't know, like a spike driven in their head. They're like, okay, this part of your brain coordinates your arm motion, and it got all fucked up, so now you can't move your arm. Makes sense. But then suddenly you start having people who can't move their arms.
But there's no organic basis that he can find.
Precisely. There's no lesion, right? And so Charcot, who has this very systematic mind, starts being like, okay, these behaviors can be systematized and broken down into what he calls hysterio-epileptic attacks. And as he starts asking questions of these people, he notices two things. One, the timeline on which these disorders present is generally related. It is about a week or 2 weeks after some sort of precipitating trauma, some sort of injury.
Mm-hmm.
But also, and this is crucial for our purposes, it's a dysfunction or a disorder that is not, he calls it even a disorder of representation. It's not grounded in a physical thing, but it's literally in the mental awareness of the person or the idea. And one of the famous cases he gives is a story of a guy named Pym, right? Who, again, he always says like, this is not all people. This is the hereditary things. Like some people are degenerate. Some people are primed for this. But basically there's a fare jumper named Pym who gets on a train without paying his fare somewhere in Paris, right? And then the police are coming, the gendarmes are coming after him, and Pym is like, okay, I'm going to get caught, I'm going to get collared, and tries to jump out of the train. And as he's jumping out of the train, think like some like Buster Keaton movie or a Looney Tunes thing. As he's going out, he realizes, oh shit, we're about to go into a tunnel. So this guy thinks he's about to get creamed. Now, a gendarme grabs him and pulls him back in, but by then Pym has already fainted. Then 2 weeks later, suddenly, Pym is like, I can't get up. I'm paralyzed. Now, the way Charcot understands this, going back to what we just talked about what the primary ideas is, he was like, he had an idea, I'm about to be paralyzed. And he had a shock to his system. Another key feature of this, like shocking of the system, the whole nervous system.
There's a lot of like precipitating events in all of this.
And then, so the normal associations of how your body works and how events affect your body have become disassociated by an event in which you suddenly had this thought, I'm going to be paralyzed. And then later it comes back.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it comes back in the body.
Precisely.
Specifically.
And so this is where this leads our man Charcot to abandon the epiphenomenalist empiricism that he earlier had. He basically says, oh, it's actually an idea or the thought of an idea that can produce a physical symptom. Mm-hmm. In other words, he calls it, a phrase here is psychogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
And note, he gets at this through observation. And here's a good quote. If a doctor is an observer that he knows how to see, if you tell him this is the greatest possible compliment one can give him, right? So as he gets more and more fascinated
mm-hmm.
with this particular category of
mm-hmm.
people who have no underlying organic condition,
he
starts trying to be like, well, how can I heal them?
Yes.
But also, how can I learn more about that moment of dissociation?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where he then discovers, he then experiments with, among other things, hypnosis.
Yeah.
And hypnosis, for our purposes, it's a real thing. Some people are more or less susceptible to it, right?
Yeah. And some people are more or less good at doing it, including Freud, who was bad at doing hypnosis.
Yeah.
Like, actually, if Freud had been good at doing hypnosis, like, there might not be psychoanalysis.
Exactly. And he basically develops a system of he basically postulates that there are a whole series of steps that basically happen when you hypnotize somebody. Mm-hmm. And he's doing this generally by producing their lethargy, catalepsy, and somnambulism, for those of you who care. But basically, it's like, if you can get someone tired or fatigued, if you can get them into a certain type of state, you can suggest things to them. And notably, in the case of hysterical paralyses, people were like, I can't move my arm.
Mm-hmm.
Then this guy hypnotizes you, says, move your arm. They can't.
Yeah.
Right? Or like he throws a ball at you and you catch it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So he postulates two things. One, that the hypnoid state resembles the state of disassociation that happened in the precipitating injury. So he ultimately argues that the process, what he calls hysterical neuroses and traumatic paralysis specifically, is basically the mind hypnotizing itself in error. Like your associationistic mind goes along and then you disassociate, you self-hypnotized, right? That's the cause of it. But then you can cure it through hypnosis. And so his demonstrations of this involve demonstration.
Very well attended.
Yeah, they're beautiful paintings of this. They're mm-hmm. photos of this. He essentially induces hysterical fits, but also alleviates long-lasting symptoms, at least temporarily, through this process of hypnotic, like what we call hypnotic suggestion, etc. And Freud is very impressed by this.
So one thing that I want you to note here is that Charcot is not thinking about hysteria in the really old school way in which it is something that only women are susceptible to, although the vast majority of his hysterical patients at the Salpêtrière are still women. And when people think about Charcot's hysterics, which you'll see that phrase in literature about the history of psychoanalysis, like they are usually talking about women. But it is important that Charcot does not adhere to that. And that is something that, Patrick alluded to, them having a break. That's something that Freud does take from Charcot, is the idea that hysteria is not essentially a gendered problem. Even though it is Freud's female patients largely from whom he learns the most about hysteria. Okay, the next text in the standard edition after the Paris and Berlin report is this is still 1886. It's the preface to the translation of Charcot's lectures on the diseases of the nervous system. This is extremely brief. It is literally one page in a little bit in the standard edition. I don't have that much to say about it. Freud asked Charcot who granted him permission to translate his work on neuroses and specifically hysteria. The major feature of this to me is something that we have already talked about in the Paris and Berlin report, which is this idealization. It's really like it's a brief intro. Freud translated this. Like, it's so masterful. It's so wonderful. Charcot is so incredible.
And just to put this within the pattern here too, this Freud asks him to translate it into German, even though his French actually isn't very good. This is something that people have noted. There's actually some real mistranslation. Freud's French is not so great.
Oh, yeah.
But this is part of Freud's now going back to Vienna, to Mary Martha. And his whole thing is, I'm going to set up shop in Vienna as the disciple of Charcot, and so just as he did with cocaine, or tried to do, just as he tried to do with
eels.
Eels, he's like, I'm the Charcot guy.
Yeah.
I'm the hypnosis guy. Mm-hmm. This is my thing. And literally, I studied under the guy who's sometimes called the sovereign ruler of the kingdom of neuroses. And just to say,
whenever there's a new kind of guy, it's a kind of guy that Freud's always trying to be.
It's the Freud guy. And we got to say, just to quickly preview this, because I think this is to tie a bow on it, and then we'll get to the actual case of the hysteric, because that'll be more interesting. Like, this also, like other things, doesn't work out for Freud. It doesn't work out for Freud for a bunch of reasons, not least of that he's bad at hypnosis, as Abby said.
Yeah.
But also, Charcot basically fucks up, because Charcot insists that a lot of things that that are subsequently, or even in his own lifetime, are proven to have an organic basis. Specifically, a lot of symptoms that are associated with syphilis.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, this is a disease. You can get this. He's like, no. This is a hysterical neurosis. And people are like, no, buddy, this is fucking syphilis. Like, but the other thing that happens too is that Freud, and there's a critique via a fellow named Bernheim, who's very important later in Freud's career, who's basically like, oh no, this is just suggestion, right? And finally, as Sandra Gilman has argued, I think very persuasively, among other things, this idea of the intergenerational taint, or the hereditary thing in families that Charcot still insists on. Freud basically, literally, he calls them stigmata, by the way. Charcot calls these stigmata that come from the father or whatever. Freud is like, basically, not explicitly, he basically says like, yeah, this is kind of anti-Semitic. This goes in bad places. This doesn't prevent him later, when Charcot dies in the 20s, from saying, he left me with a deep impression that one should never tire of considering the same phenomenon again and again, and one should not mind meeting with contradiction on every side, provided one has worked sincerely. So he still has some element of it.
Yeah, which is actually like an echo of the passage that I read from before. It's from 1886. All right. The final piece that we're going to talk about today is also from 1886. It is observation of a severe case of hemi-anesthesia in a hysterical male, which the standard edition then calls a case of male hysteria to make things a little bit shorter. So we're going to call it that. This is interesting. I had not read this before. I had never even heard that this existed before. This piece, I've read a lot of Freud case studies. It's probably because it's so early. So the background is this. Freud, also in 1886, but before this, gives a previous paper on male hysteria before the Vienna Society of Medicine. It was poorly received. And he was challenged to present a case of male hysteria, because presumably this is something that was like understood not to exist in men, right? So this case study presenting this so-called hysterical male is a direct response to that challenge. And I guess I want to just kind of say a little bit about the experience of reading this piece. Because for me, as somebody who has read like all the major Freud case studies, which are so, they're like short stories. But like a lot, how a lot of people don't like short stories? Like they're like, I want to read a novel. I don't want to read a short story. Freud's case studies are like the most interesting. Oh, yeah. Like he gets you in like 2 sentences and you're like, ooh, say more about that. Like, literally this is called Observations of a Severe Case of Hemi-Anesthesia in a Hysterical Male. I did not expect it to be such compelling reading. It is very compelling reading. What I want to say, directly connecting this piece to what Patrick has been filling us in about on Charcot's conception of hysteria, and specifically this idea of like, what is the etiology? What are the origins of these things that seem inexplicable? Like nothing seems to be harming this part of this man's body organically, and yet he has these symptoms. So the difference for the most part, at least in the sort of diagnostic part of this piece, which is divided kind of in half. The first half is kind of like a story, and the second half is like I'm poking and prodding this guy. Literally, he's like, I got him with the needle on the left side that's paralyzed. He didn't feel it, like this guy. But it is not, as later case studies will be, it is not an exploration of this man's psyche.
No.
It is about his body. It's about his physical symptoms. But there's still that like Freudian keen observational eye and that desire to do a character sketch, okay, that is here. So Freud says he thinks that this is a very ordinary case, but a type that's overlooked, which I read as a sort of little jab at all of the people that are like, show me a male hysteric. Show me one. Just show me one. And he finds one. He's 29 years old. He's an engraver. His name is August P. And Freud tells us in a way that I think if I were a member of the Vienna Society of Medicine in 1886, I'd be like, this is a little too much. He tells us all about his family. Because let me be clear from the title, this man, August P., he can't feel anything on his left side. That's the like Hemi-Anesthesia. So he's like birth order, siblings, family background, all of this stuff. And again, you would expect this in what we would now think of as a case study or a psychological study, but not so much where the focus is, again, on the body. Interestingly, though, up until he gets to the actual symptoms, again, it has this short story quality. There's intrigue, there's drama, there's betrayal. There is, again, to go back to what Patrick was talking about, there's not one, but multiple precipitating incidents. And everywhere there is characterization, even where you would not expect it to be. And I want to read a passage just to give you, this is the only passage I'm going to read from this. It is pretty long. I want listeners to have a sense of like, what does this read like? And let me tell you that, like, interestingly, in a piece where the whole thrust of it is half of this man can't feel, half of him can, this case study actually replicates that. The first half of the piece is all about feeling, all about family. And the second part is like narrowly and rigidly about anatomy. Okay. It's very interesting. All right. So here's the first part. Our patient developed normally in his childhood. He never suffered from infantile convulsions and went through the usual children's diseases. In his 8th year, he had the misfortune of being run over in the street. He sustained a rupture of the right eardrum with permanent impairment of hearing in the right ear, and he fell sick of an illness which lasted for several months, during which he suffered frequently from fits, the nature of which it is no longer possible to discover today. These fits continued for some 2 years. To this accident dates back a slight intellectual dullness which the patient claims to have noticed in his progress at school, and a tendency to feelings of giddiness whenever he was unwell for any reason. Later, he completed his schooling, and after his parents' death was apprenticed to an engraver. And it speaks very favorably for his character that he remained his journeyman with the same master for 10 years. He pictures himself as a person whose thoughts were wholly and solely directed to perfection in his skilled craft, who with that end in view did much reading and drawing and denied himself all social intercourse and all entertainments. He was obliged to reflect a great deal about himself and his ambition, and in doing so often fell into a state of an excited flight of ideas in which he became alarmed about his mental health. His sleep was often disturbed, his digestion was slowed down by his sedentary way of life. He has suffered from palpitations for the last 9 years, but otherwise he was healthy and never interrupted in his work. His present illness dates back for some 3 years. At that time, he fell into a dispute with his dissolute brother, who refused to pay him back a sum of money he had lent him. His brother threatened to stab him and ran at him with a knife. This threw the patient into indescribable fear. He felt a ringing in his head as though it was going to burst. He hurried home without being able to tell how he got there and fell to the ground unconscious in front of his door. It was reported afterwards that for 2 hours he had the most violent spasms and had spoken during them of the scene with his brother. When he woke up, he felt very feeble. During the next 6 weeks, he suffered from violent left-sided headaches and intracranial pressure. The feeling in the left half of his body seemed to him altered, and his eyes got easily tired at his work, which he soon took up again. With a few oscillations, his condition remained like this for 3 years until 7 weeks ago, a fresh agitation brought on a change for the worse. The patient was accused by a woman of a theft, had violent palpitations, was so depressed for about a fortnight that he thought of suicide, and at the same time, a fairly severe tremor set in his left extremities. The left half of his body felt as though it had been affected by a slight stroke. His eyes became very weak and often made him see everything gray. His sleep was interrupted by terrifying apparitions and by dreams in which he thought he was falling from a great height. Pains started in the left side of his throat, in his left groin, in the sacral region, and in other areas. His stomach was often as though it was blown out, and he found himself obliged to stop working. A further worsening of all these symptoms dates from the last week. In addition, the patient is subject to violent pains in his left knee and his left sole if he walks for some time. He has a peculiar feeling in his throat as though his tongue was fastened up. He has frequent singing in his ears and more of the same sort. His memory is impaired for his experiences during his illness, but is good for earlier events. After this section, then again, we get this snap into organic Dr. Freud. I press on this and the following happens. I poke him here, this happens. I put a needle in him, he doesn't feel it. So his right side is normal, his left side is numb, or he doesn't have, this one is interesting, he doesn't have access to awareness of it. So he can't find his left eye or his left ear with his hands. If he reaches up, he can't find it. If he stands on his left leg and closes his eyes, he falls down. This is also a place where we see Freud appeal to the idea of hysterogenic zones. So even within the numb side, the left side, there are still painful spots. I don't know if this is the first appearance of the idea of hysterogenic zones, but I want to flag that for listeners now, because in the future, we're going to see these a lot in the case studies. And they're basically painful spots that don't make sense from an anatomical or physiological perspective. And the whole piece winds up with a note on the instability of the anesthesia. It's moving around, right? Which is, again, a kind of clue to Freud that this is a hysterical rather than an organic illness. It moves, which also, and so he closes with this, robust hope that he's going to be able to solve this patient's problem soon, resolve the symptoms. It's all going to be good.
It's an amazing case study. And I think as an artifact, and just to really tie a bow on this, right? Here's where we can see Freud doing this thing, these consistent movements of integration, synthesis, idealization, yes, but also rejection, put together and then moving forward, right? If one of the things Charcot basically did was be okay, and this, is a thing you contribute to him, not just women can be hysterics because actually the thing is brains and everybody's got a brain, but wait, it's certain families that have degenerative heredity. And if you have the right combination, or certain racial types even, if you have the right combination of degenerative heredity plus precipitating event, then you're going to be a hysteric. Freud, on the one hand, takes some things from it, and on the other hand, moves from it and basically says, actually, the issue isn't just that everyone can have brains and everyone can have injuries. The idea is, nor still that it's a problem of degeneration down a family line, while grappling with the mind-body problem as you've described it in this really rigorous way or this really intense way that sits alongside itself poorly. He basically is saying, actually, hysteria can happen to anyone, not because of degenerative heredity plus trauma, but rather because of trauma plus the specific heightened vulnerability we have to trauma in the context of this thing called the family.
Yes.
And I gotta say, this is just coming to me now, but I think it's beautifully imminent in the stuff you were saying already, right? This idea to read Freud do this, produce this kind of lopsided, weird text that's half medical stuff, half incipient Freud, half narrative focused and families focused, half about weird 19th century medical terminology and embodiment. But also it's all about this young man's struggles with like his bad brother and then being accused of being a criminal like his bad brother was. And then it's only one side of this guy's body.
Yeah.
It's impossible not to read this thinking of, yes, on the one hand, Freud doing a separation of good and bad vis-a-vis what am I going to take from Charcot? Am I really his son or am I my own person, etc.?
Yeah.
But also that letter I read from Martha or to Martha earlier about like, I've got to I'm really worried about the taint I have inherited.
Yes.
And I can't easily put it away by simply saying it's just on one side of my family.
Beautiful. Patrick, thank you so much. You did a lot of prep for this episode, and I really appreciate you being, I don't know, not just my co-host, but also today my guest expert. Let me tell you all where we're going next. So we're going to be in volume 1 for a little while, which again is the pre-psychoanalytic publications and unpublished drafts. But the broad theme of the next episode is going to be hysteria, because we're going to read some more by Freud on hysteria. And then there's a whole section here that are the papers on hypnotism and suggestion. So if you're interested in what we're saying about that, you're going to be so there's like a case of successful treatment by hypnotism. Charcot is not going anywhere. And then we're also going to get into what some of you who might be particularly interested in the studies on hysteria, which we have appealed to, starting with our first episode, where we talked about Anna O. That's where that appears. We're not yet to the studies on hysteria, but we'll be getting to the sketches for the preliminary communication. He's going to be writing to Breuer, who's the one who taught Anna O. So we're really getting into like the nitty gritty of the like wind up to the studies on hysteria. After that, we're going to go into the fleece papers. We're going to do that with special guest Christine Smallwood, who you might remember from the Beyond episode. I really wanted to have a literary critic, and particularly that literary critic, to read the fleece papers with me. And we'll say a lot more about that. But those are some of the only letters that are included in the standard edition. There is no one single collected volume of Freud's letters, but most of them do not appear within, like you have to go outside of the standard edition for them. But these have been included because they're so important in the development of what we have been referring to as like the early Freud, which when I say the early Freud, I mean something like studies on hysteria, I mean the interpretation of dreams, I mean the psychopathology of everyday life, and I mean the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. And then the last episode we're going to do from volume 1 is Project for Scientific Psychology. And that I am bringing Patrick back for. And we'll have a lot to say about the Project for Scientific Psychology. It is a failed project, but there is still we've talked a bit about the way that we admire the way that Freud publishes his failures. But anyway, more on that to come. We are so grateful to you all for thinking and for some of you reading along with us. This is a series that is exclusively for our patrons. We appreciate you so much. And I'm going to ask one more thing of you, which is tell your friends and please rate and review, on Apple or Spotify or wherever you are listening. That is so, so helpful for us. Thank you again for going with us on this, what it promises to be a very extensive journey with more side quests than we can possibly even imagine, but they're coming. Thank you all so much. We will see you next week. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.